Welcome, everyone, to the On Poly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, a third NDP MPP is leaving provincial politics behind to run federally.
There's a new lawsuit between Metrolinx and the builders of the Finch LRT in Toronto.
And should we make the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation a statutory holiday in Ontario?
And in your column, my column, I will focus on the bleak state of the Liberal brand, both federally and provincially.
And I'm paying tribute to the oldest American president ever, Jimmy Carter, who turned 100 years old earlier this week.
It's Friday, October 4th, 2024, so let's get to it.
Hey, partner.
Oh, sir.
Little sugar for starters there. You do know it's October 4th and not May the 4th, right?
Yes, I know. But I have a lot of Star Wars shirts, so they kind of go in rotation. And I am once again wearing a Star Wars shirt for the podcast.
For those listening on podcast, we should say you've got the Millennium Falcon and a bunch of
X-Wings and et cetera.
Yeah, but that's something you wear on May the 4th be with you, not on October the 4th be with you.
Well, I do also have specifically a May 4th shirt that I have also worn for TVO content before.
I look forward to seeing it next spring.
Okay.
With that, we should mention that, once in a while, I think we've told people in the past, we shoot these podcasts, we tend to shoot them on Thursday because we really want to be in people's inboxes first thing Friday morning. And that means rarely, but occasionally, we miss something that happens sort of late Thursday afternoon, and this may be one of those occasions today.
Yes, it might be. There is a technical briefing happening a Thursday afternoon about Ontario Place. We don't know what specifically the contents of that briefing are going to be. It seems likely to be newsworthy. I know people really are paying attention to the Ontario Place issue. We don't want people to think that we are ignoring the issue on this podcast, but unfortunately, you and I are not time travelers either. So
there is that. Now, if it were really devastating news for the government, methinks they would be announcing this on the Friday, late afternoon, like 5 or 5:30 on a Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah, if they could hold off for a week or two, yeah.
Right. So the fact that they are not doing that suggests maybe the roof isn't falling in for them, but something newsworthy.
Yes, a roof falling in being something that this government has had an issue with before.
Maybe once or twice. And with that, let's get to issue one. And now it's three. Butila Carpoche has announced she won't run again in provincial politics. Instead, she's seeking the federal NDP nomination in the Toronto riding of Parkdale High Park. She joins two other New Democrats, Hamilton Mountain MPP Monique Taylor and Ottawa Centre MPP Joel Harden, to announce their intention to leave Queen's Park. So, JMM, what do you think's going on here?
Well, a few things. The federal Liberals are in, I would say, maybe a historically weak position right now, and an election, because it's a minority parliament, an election could really come at any time, but certainly it has to come by this time next year. Carpoche's riding of Parkdale High Park has been held by the Liberals since 2015, but it had been held by New Democrat Peggy Nash before that. And the New Democrats have held it provincially now since 2006. First, it was Sherry DeNovo, who took the riding after Gerard Kennedy left provincial politics, and then Butila Carpoche succeeded DeNovo. Certainly a riding that Carpoche has a lot of roots in and a lot of support for. This could be one of those ridings that we've seen a few cases of where a Liberal riding has flipped to one of the other parties. We saw federally the riding of St. Paul's was rather surprisingly flipped to a Conservative after a by-election earlier this year.
I wouldn't say surprisingly. I'd say shockingly.
Yes.
I'd say mind-blowingly shockingly. It is interesting. Usually when you see stories like this, when you've got, three MPPs from a caucus who all decide pretty much around the same time that they want to leave provincial politics, you do get a bunch of stories, usually written by people who cover Queen's Park, saying, oh, look at this, lack of support for the leader. They don't think their chances are very good for winning the next election, so they're leaving now to go, to another level of government. It's funny, but I'm not hearing that this time around. I am not hearing a lack of support for Marit Stiles. I'm not hearing that they're leaving because they don't like their chances in the next provincial election, whenever that happens. You've got a case, I think, where you've got three different people making three different decisions for three very different reasons. Take Joel Harden in Ottawa Centre. The fact of the matter is, he spends a lot of time right now either flying or driving between Ottawa and Toronto, as the member for Ottawa Centre coming to Toronto all the time. if you're an MP and you represent Ottawa Centre, Parliament is in your riding. It is geographically the best job you can get in terms of travel.
Yes.
So, that explains that one anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's not just New Democrats who are choosing not to run again. Conservative MPPs have also decided they've either resigned outright or announced that they will not be running again. That list would include names like Monty McNaughton, Rick Byers, Lisa MacLeod, Todd Smith, and then, of course, Christine Elliott in the last election chose not to offer again. So you mentioning the lack of rumors about support for Marit Stiles. Anything unusual going on with the Tories here?
Well, again, I would say in the main, probably not. There's always a tendency for us to want to find, the truth behind the story. In the case of Todd Smith, there certainly was a story behind the story, which is he didn't want to get shuffled out of energy to education. He warned them not to do that. They did that, so he quit. And now he's got a job in the nuclear industry. For most of the others, not Rick Byers, because he's in his first term only. For most of the others, they've had good long runs at Queen's Park. At some point, you figure, particularly if they're in their 50s or 60s, they may want to try something else with their life, something as simple as that, and so they are.
And, we should also mention, federal MPs, they start off by making more than provincial MPPs do. Provincial MPP salaries, I believe, have been frozen since the last decade.
More, I think.
Yeah, it's basically, I think, since the 2008 financial crisis. They froze salaries, and nobody's had the political wherewithal to unfreeze them. And we've mentioned this before on the podcast, MPPs do not have pensions.
And it is amazing how many times I talk to people and they will say, well, of course they want to get elected to Queen's Park. They got those big fat pensions that take care of them for the rest of their lives. Actually not. We'll say it again. We've said it before. Mike Harris, the former premier, the 22nd premier of Ontario, got rid of MPPs' pensions almost 30 years ago. So, at this point, we've really got to say people tend not to hang around Queen's Park to get those fat pensions. There's no pension. There's been no pay increase for the longest time. I'm not saying we should have a tag day for these folks, but I am explaining why they feel they may need to leave if they've got a better offer on the outside.
Yeah, and Todd Smith was quite open about this, that, when he left for the private sector, he said, he has to think about his financial security, and he can get more financial security working in the private sector than he can as an MPP. And I very briefly will get on a soapbox and think, this might be something we want to think about. I realize, pensions for public servants are not like a super popular issue, but it is shaping people's decisions about how they serve the public. And maybe we want to hang on to somebody like Todd Smith.
John Michael, it is the one thing I hear from candidate recruitment types from all the parties more than anything else. How do I encourage people to leave? For example, if you're a lawyer or whatever, even a teacher, you make a good six-figure salary. How do I convince you to quit doing what you're doing, to run for Queen's Park, where the salary is, I think it's $112,000 a year or something like that,
yeah.
And there's no pension? How do you really get people to leave good jobs to go into public life to do public service when the pay cut in some cases? Take a look at Peter Bethlen-Falvey.
Right,
took an 85% pay cut to go into public life. Anyway, some people can do it. For others, that's a heavy lift. And with that, we're on to issue 2. Another day, another transit building headache for the people of Ontario. This time, it is the Finch LRT across the northwest part of Ontario's capital city. And again, the players can't seem to stay out of court. What is going on here?
So before we get into it, I do want to give a shout out to our colleagues at Global News who first reported this story. Like a lot of public-private partnership stories, this one has a few moving parts, so I'm going to try and break it down for our audience as simply as I can. So Metrolinx contracted with a private consortium to build the Finch LRT. This is how we do large transit projects in Ontario these days. That consortium is called the Mosaic Transit Group. But they are not going to run the LRT when it is complete. The TTC will, the city's existing transit agency. So that has meant, both for the case of Finch and the Eglinton Crosstown before it, that the TTC has taken on this role in the process, basically saying, it's not complete until we say it is.
They are the deciders.
Right. If we're going to run this thing after it's done, then we want to have the final say on what is complete. And so this has caused problems because the TTC was never formally a signatory to the contracting process. In both the Crosstown and now the Finch LRT cases, the builders, the consortia, have said, like, the TTC is taking on a role that's far larger and more intrusive than we ever signed on for. Mosaic has basically said to the province, or rather, they've said to Metrolinx, that they want the TTC held accountable, which I am taking to mean that they want somebody to yank the chain on the city's transit agency and have its role reduced, or basically just tell them to, sign off on the work and get this thing done. Now, there is also, of course, money involved. Lots of money in the case of these LRT projects, but Metrolinx is currently withholding $500 million from the Mosaic consortium until everybody agrees that the line is complete. Once that money is paid, the builders would then turn the line over to the TTC.
I think you can have some sympathy for the TTC's position on this, because once they take it over and say it's fit to ride, the second anything goes wrong, the public is going to demand accountability from ultimately the person left holding the bag, and that's the TTC. They're not going to go after the consortium. They're not going to go after the province. They're not going to go after Metrolinx. They're going to say, TTC, why isn't this thing working? And the TTC will say, well, we told you it wasn't working, and yet you made us sign off on it.
Well, and we've seen just how complicated these disputes can get in Ottawa. And this is, the Premier has said repeatedly, this is sort of the nightmare that they want to avoid, where there have been numerous problems with the Ottawa LRT after it opened. And everybody's pointing fingers at each other going like, your fault, no, your fault. So
just a reminder that the Finch line and the Eglinton Crosstown line, there are no official opening dates yet. And I'm trying to remember now, when did they start working on the Crosstown, the Eglinton Crosstown? I mean, it's a decade anyway. It's more than a decade.
More than a decade, yeah. I believe they finalized the design of it in 2010 and started construction after that.
That is amazing. Anyway, Premier Ford did speak about this past week. He was asked when he expects the lines to open. I think they had that news conference on Wednesday of this week, and here is what he had to say.
Are we going to hit the next few months? Hopefully we will. If not, it will be in the new year. But my number one concern is we do not want an Ottawa disaster. Let's just make sure all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, and we get a safe operation. But
you get that. Obviously, they don't want the line to open up and somebody get injured riding it because the thing jumped the tracks or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And we can't go too long in this podcast without talking about the prospects of a surprise election.
We
next
never
year.
do. We never do go too long.
Increasingly unsurprising surprise election. So, it's worth saying that if the Premier wants an election next spring, he would really, really like to have both the Crosstown and the Finch LRT up and running with real, live, fare-paying passengers, if at all possible. Ideally, you actually want it to open well in advance of an election so that if there are any hopefully minor bumps and hiccups in the opening of these transit programs, that you can get them out of the way before people head to the ballot box. That's another way of saying that both of these private consortia actually have a very strong bargaining position with the government right now. If there is money that needs to be paid to accelerate the completion of these projects, to just grease the wheels, so to speak, maybe that money will have to be paid. And I mean, it's not like insane to speculate about this because, of course, the government has paid money.
I'm just thinking right now, has the government ever spent any money in order to advance by, let's say a year, something that was not due to happen for yet another year? Has that ever happened? I
mean, we're recording this a bit early in the day, so I won't crack open a beer on camera, but people get what we're talking about.
You read my mind. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Well, let's sneak in a little bit more transportation news while we're on the subject here, because at that same news conference that we just clipped the Premier from, he talked about the 407. And we've talked about the 407 here as well. This is the privately owned highway that goes across the top of Toronto, north of the 401. And there has been much speculation as to whether or not the province should buy it back. Here's what the Premier had to say about that.
All options are on the table. Let's look at both options as well, because we know that the 407 is going to be totally jammed in the next 20 years. But let's look at all options.
A little background here. The 407 highway was built to be a toll highway, meaning if you want to drive on it, you've got to pay to use it. Your taxes don't pay to run it. Bob Ray's government built that highway in the early 1990s. It was sold by Mike Harris's government in 1999 at a cost of $3.1 billion. Mr. Harris made a lot of decisions in his time at Queen's Park. I think historians would suggest this was one of the worst decisions made. He sold the highway in order to balance the books in 1 year. He sold it at a price that was much below what most people think he could have got for it right now. The cost to buy it back in the future, if Premier Ford wants to do that, he sold it for $3.1 billion. Probably cost 10 times that to buy it back today.
Yeah, exactly. That would be extremely costly, but it is one of these options we're discussing because it would still be cheaper than building the 401 tunnel that the Premier has proposed. But it would be cheaper still to subsidize the use of the 407 for freight trucks, which is an issue that we've been discussing now for years, with all of the opposition parties suggesting, initially they were suggesting that as an alternative to building the 413 highway. And now they are re-raising that issue. Back in 2022, a group called Transit Action Ontario estimated that it would cost just $4 billion over 30 years. It's still a huge sum of money, but it's like comparatively small given the other figures we're talking about here.
As they always say, amortize, amortize,
Yes,
amortize.
exactly.
$4 billion over 30 years for a provincial government ain't that much.
Yeah. And so even if that estimate turned out to be extremely optimistic, it is difficult to imagine that it would be somehow more expensive than buying the 407 back entirely. And again, it would be much, much less expensive than building the 401 tunnel.
Stay tuned, everybody. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Monday of this week marked the 4th National Truth and Reconciliation Day. It's a day when we reflect upon the lasting impact residential schools have had on Indigenous peoples. Federally, it's a holiday. Provincially, not so.
That's right. New Democrat MPP Saul Mamakwa has said he will put forward a private member's bill when the House resumes. Resume later this month. He will bring the bill in November that would designate the day a holiday for a statutory holiday in Ontario. He argues it would be another form of reconciliation. In this context, we should mention Mamakwa is himself a survivor of residential schools.
So that's his idea. How has the government responded to it so far?
Well, so far, they haven't ruled it out. Rick Byers is Ontario's Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He has said he isn't sure that a holiday would do the day justice, but has not outright said no to the idea entirely.
It's a good debate, and here's why. Because on the one hand, society shows its concern and commitment to issues by giving a statutory holiday to them. I think the last one we got was Dalton McGuinty, created Family Day, right, in the middle of February, because he thought it was cold, it was miserable in the wintertime, and that was right in the middle of the winter, and families needed a chance just to have a day to be together. There are other days, I guess that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is that sometimes people don't take those days in order to consider what they're really supposed to be about, but rather they sleep in, they go to the mall, they go to a movie, they just take the paid holiday, and they miss the point of the whole thing. And if that's what were to happen, if you gave a statutory holiday for National Truth and Reconciliation, then it would kind of defeat the purpose of the whole thing.
Yeah, I was reading the headlines about Mamakwa's bill as I was dropping my child off to school on Reconciliation Day, and it is a big deal in at least in Toronto schools right now. All the kids wearing orange T-shirts, a lot of the teachers wearing orange shirts. They take it very, very seriously. And I am reminded of a similar argument about whether Remembrance Day should be a statutory holiday. And at least last time I looked into this, the position of the Canadian Legion was like, no, actually, we think kids should be in school for Remembrance Day. Schools do a very good job of imparting the importance of Remembrance Day and making it a solemn occasion. And at least based on what I have seen from my sample size of one child in the school system, her school is doing a very good job of imparting that seriousness and the solemnity to the day. That said, I wouldn't want to presume to suggest that I know the proper route to reconciliation better than Saul Mamakwa.
No, I understand that, but you may have some intuition into how society would react, and I'm going to echo what you just said. I know when I was growing up in Hamilton, Remembrance Day was a very big day at our school, and we had big ceremonies, and You know, this was long enough ago that we actually had war veterans who were teachers among those. We had teachers who fought in World War II, and they would show up on that day in uniform with medals on. And it was important for the kids to see that these aren't just teachers, these are people who saved our democracy. So, on the one hand, yes, you do want to show respect for an idea, especially when Saul Mamakwa brings it forward. He's a guy with a great deal of integrity. On the other hand, you wouldn't want to miss an opportunity to have all kids in school really focused on that issue. It's a hard one.
No, it is. And, I think this is, frankly, why private members' bills are such a great way for the legislature to discuss exactly these issues. I think this is absolutely a debate that MPPs should have.
Indeed. And with that, it's on to your column, my column. Okay, you know this regular feature we do every week. It's called Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for our website, tvo.org, over the past week. Start us off, if you would, sir.
So I wrote about the bleak state of the Liberal brand, both federally and provincially right now. We just had Bonnie Crombie on the podcast last week, and I think it's fair to say the Liberals provincially are doing better than they have in recent years. They are still struggling in a lot of ways. Federally, things seem to go from bad to worse polling-wise. What makes this an Ontario story, or at least the Ontario angle to this story, is that in previous eras, when the Liberals have hit a rough patch, they have always retreated to safe areas, safe harbors in Quebec, but also in Ontario, and particularly in Toronto. And what is so striking lately is that some of those refuges no longer seem so safe. We mentioned Toronto St. Paul's earlier in the podcast, a riding that I thought would be Liberal forever and was taken by the Conservatives in a by-election earlier this year. Similarly, a riding in Montreal was flipped in recent by-elections. So yeah, this fundamental issue of what we used to think were safe seats just don't seem to be safe anymore. The Liberals have been in bad straits before. People who remember just the stretch between 2011 and 2015 before Justin Trudeau led them back to government, could say, well, we've always bounced back before. I'm not sure it's ever been this bad. I mean, even after I wrote that column, more bad polls came out. One suggested that the Liberals might not even win a single seat west of Quebec.
They're in fourth place in English Canada right now.
Exactly.
Behind the NDP.
So, again, polling doesn't tell us what will absolutely for certain happen in the next election. Things could turn around, but I really wanted to stress just how bad it is and how even safe parts of Ontario don't seem to be so safe anymore. And so I wrote about that for the website, and I also included a bit of an analogy to woolly mammoths during the Ice Age.
You know what? I gotta say,
I had fun with it.
I gotta say, I read your stuff and I like the way you write. And you started to write this column by talking about the woolly mammoth. And I must confess, I started to scratch my head and I said, what the heck is he writing about here? And I thought, well, it's John Michael. I'll indulge him and see where he's going with this thing, talking about the woolly mammoth off the top. And they said, oh, okay, yes, he's bringing it full circle. Now I get what he was trying to do. Okay, so you think the Liberals are going the way of the woolly mammoth? We shall see.
We shall see, indeed.
We shall see.
How about you, Steve?
I have had the great good fortune in my life to have met I guess, a couple of American presidents. And I remember one day about 15 years ago, my great friend Arthur Milnes, who's a historian from Kingston, Ontario, called me one day and he said, I'm going down to Plains, Georgia pretty soon to go have a private dinner with Jimmy Carter, whom he knew because he'd written to Jimmy Carter when he was a high school student.
Oh, wow.
And Mr. Carter wrote him back, and that started a friendship between the two of them, which saw Arthur go to Plains more than 25 times to visit his friends, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. Anyway, he said to me, do you want to come down and have dinner with me and the former president and the first lady? And I think I paused for about 1/100th of a second before saying, yes, absolutely I want to go. And it's something we ended up doing a few times. Arthur and I and a few other people went down to Plains, Georgia. We had dinner with Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter. It was, as you might expect, it was extraordinary. On the one hand, to be having a meal, spending time with somebody who's had their finger on the nuclear button and who was the most powerful person in the world is really quite astonishing. Also, the fact that he was so open with us, you could ask him anything. He would give you honest answers. John Michael, I had one case. We're sitting there in Mum's Kitchen in Plains, Georgia. It's a restaurant, and there's people all around, and there he is sitting there in his red plaid shirt and his blue jeans and his cowboy boots, and nobody's paying him any attention. It's a former president, but of course it's just Jimmy. They all know him down there. And I said to him, this is going to sound like a strange request, but I got my camcorder here. Would you mind doing an interview with me right now as we're having dinner? He said, no problem. I took the camcorder out, put it on my shoulder. This is the day before iPhones, there's no such thing. Got the camcorder out here. We're eating. I'm eating with my left hand. I'm shooting with my right hand. I'm asking him all sorts of questions about everything. And anyway, all this stuff is up on our website. And I raise it all now, of course, because Jimmy Carter turned 100 years old this past week. Really an astonishing accomplishment, not only because it makes him the oldest living American president ever, but if you look at what cancer did to his family. He lost so many members of his family prematurely to cancer, and he himself had cancer, I think less than 10 years ago, and somehow managed to beat it back. And the notion that he would ever turn 100, if you're part of the Carter family in Plains, Georgia, you just wouldn't think that was on. But there he is, and I'm glad that historians are reevaluating his time as president, which at the time was seen as a failure because he didn't win a second term.
Yes.
But with the fullness of time, there were a lot of accomplishments there to talk about, and I mentioned some of them in the piece.
Well, one of his accomplishments before he became president, he's also, I don't know if he's technically a nuclear engineer, but
He is. Yes, he was.
Very, very proficient with nuclear
And
technology.
worked at Chalk River near Ottawa.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, this is the Canadian connection with Jimmy Carter. He helped, I don't know how serious an incident it was, but he helped fix a serious incident at Chalk River when he was a younger man. So on behalf of Canadians, thank you, Jimmy Carter.
Amen. And happy birthday, Mr. President. And may you have many more. Okay, if you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we ask you to send it along to our email address. That's onpolitics@tvo.org. And this is the part of the program where we usually talk about whatever nice or interesting notes we got. But before we do that, I want to do a shout out because earlier this week I gave a speech about my book on John Turner to a group called the University Women's Club of North York. And a woman named Andrea Journeau came up to me afterwards. And again, I was telling you this not too long ago. Usually over the years, people come up and they say, hey, I saw you doing the agenda. I like this guest. Now I have as many people coming up to me talking about, what's JMM really like or about the podcast. And she came up and said how much she liked the podcast. So, Andrea, thank you for that. And please keep watching or listening. And then we did a show on the agenda earlier this week on COVID. It's not gone yet, incidentally, people. And McMaster University's Dawn Bowdish, who's a guest on the show, told me she likes to listen to the podcast when she's having a walk or exercising or going to work, whatever. So thank you, Dr. Bowdish. And I'm trying to convince her to watch it as well. She's just a listener at this point, but I've told her she's missing all of our sartorial splendor if she only listens and doesn't watch.
Every click helps. So,
there we go.
Download and watch it on YouTube.
So with all of that having been said, what's up this week?
So from the mailbag, we have this letter from Braden Murray from Kenora, Ontario, who writes, "Good day. I've been an On Poly podcast listener from the beginning, and I always look forward for it coming up in my feed.
Hear, hear.
I have a question for Steve. I run the Lake of the Woods Museum in Kenora, and I just had a guest ask about Leo Bernier. I talked about his electoral victories and being a cabinet minister, but frankly, my answer lacked the personal touch. So my question is, do you have any good Leo Bernier stories or anecdotes to share? To sweeten the deal, I've included images of Leo Bernier and John Robarts landing in Kenora after campaigning up north via a float plane. This is true, like Ontario classics here.
Isn't it, though?
These images are from the by-election in which Bernier was first elected in 1966. I really enjoyed the show, and JMM's COVID coverage was indispensable. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Keep up the good work, Braden."
Braden, thank you for this letter. And okay, Sheldon, should we bring these pictures up? Let's now, I guess for those who are listening on podcast and can't see them, I'll describe what's going on here. Look at John Robarts. I mean, was that guy a stud? Look at him. Suit and tie. He's up in the middle of Northern Ontario, and he looks like $1 million. That's
Landing
him.
in a bush plane, like coming out of a bush plane in
In a
Northern
suit and tie.
Ontario in a
Yeah,
suit and tie.
But he always looked like $1 million, that guy, I'll tell you. That's him on the left, Leo Bernier. Now, I always heard his name pronounced two ways. One, the more French way, Leo Bernier. But people, I think, in Northern Ontario also called him Leo Bernier.
Okay.
So I heard both pronunciations. There's a bunch of pictures here, and you can just continue to cycle those pictures through. These are the two gentlemen in Northern Ontario, having just landed in that float plane. And Mr. Robarts was the 17th Premier of Ontario. Leo Bernier represented Kenora for 21 years. Yes, it started with a by-election, which he won after the former sitting member died. That's how he got elected. Progressive Conservative, of course. How's this for a nickname? Leo Bernier was known as the Emperor of the North. That's a good name. He was a big deal in Northern Ontario. He didn't make cabinet during the John Robarts years, but in 1971, when the government flipped from Mr. Robarts to Bill Davis, got my Bill Davis reference in this week, Mr. Davis succeeded Mr. Robarts in 1971, and Mr. Bernier got into cabinet at that point. I think he was Natural Resources Minister, he was the Mines Minister, he was the Northern Affairs Minister, and he died, I think he made it to age 81. He died in 2010. A couple of years later, they named the highway in Kenora, Highway 664, after Leo Bernier. And if you want to, and I've got Highway 69 on my chest here because I'm driving to Manitoulin this weekend and we'll be on Highway 69. So this is just a note to myself to remember when you get to that cutoff, where you can go Highway 11 or Highway 69, just remind myself.
Which way to go.
Take 69 through Parry Sound, right. A little piece of trivia here. I love this. Okay, the official flower for the province of Ontario, JMM, is
the trillium.
The official tree for the province of Ontario is?
The eastern white pine.
You are good, buddy. Good for you. In 1975, it was Leo Bernier who selected amethyst as the official mineral emblem of the province of Ontario. So there you go.
I had no idea.
No, you did not. And now everybody knows. So, Braden, thank you for giving us that opportunity to remember the guy they used to call the Emperor of the North, Leo Bernier. Great guy.
Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this October 4th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell, Christine Gardner, and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our wonderful studio crew here for making the show look so darn good. And this week, we're going to do a special shout out to a guy who I think really needs our emotional support right now. Tony Burke's back there on camera, too. It's been a tough week for the Montreal Canadiens. I'm telling you, the hits have been tough. The fighting has been tough. They've been losing some of their best players. Patrick Laine's out for, I think, 3 or 4 months now with a knee injury. You didn't follow any of this, so you don't know what I'm talking about.
I'm aware they're a hockey team.
They're a hockey team, and they're going through a tough time right now. Kirby Dach got slugged the other day. Anyways, for Tony Burke, you hang in there, pal. It's a long season. Don't you worry. And until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.